Well, how about I'll read from the opening winter chapter of A Year in Practice. There are these meditative poems that kind of break up the book to show like the different parts of each season. And this is where it starts. And the poem is called Rest. Imagine all of the life underground that is waiting for spring. Envision the resting roots, the sleeping creatures, and everything below the surface that is paused for the season. Feel the fullness of this stillness. Feel the necessity of this calmness. There is silence here, in every den, in every inch of cold dirt. There is silence in your home as well. Your body needs this pause. Your mind revels in this quietness. Winter speaks to you and says, rush no longer. Put down whatever you carry, curl up and rest. Scan yourself from toe to head and head to toe, letting yourself unwind, releasing all demands. Breathe into every inch of your body as it relaxes into this healing state. Imagine yourself in a warm cocoon, wrapped in glowing light. No need to go anywhere or do anything. No need for any plan at all. Return to this place of respite every time you crave the grace of winter's restful energy. Remember, everything else is asleep now, too. Give yourself permission to go into the cave and turn inward.
Okay, everyone, welcome back to Living the Next Chapter. I have an author that has written, well, several poems in the past, and I'm excited to have Jacqueline on the podcast today. We're going to be talking about her new book, which would be book number 8, coming out December 5th time frame, and excited to talk about someone who is very prolific in her writing and very inspirational in what she does. And it's a joy for me to have her here. Jacqueline, welcome to Living the Next Chapter.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's amazing. So I said you wrote several poems. So there's a number which I love to hear about how many poems you have written in your literary journey. Can you just throw that number out for the world? What is that number?
That number connects to, the spontaneous poems that I wrote with my project Poem Store. Over 40,000 spontaneous poems. Over 40,000 poems that I will most likely never see again either, because folks get to keep them. So I write them off the cuff and on my typewriter in person for people. And then they get to keep the poem. And I never kept a copy of most of them. Sometimes I would take a photo if I really liked one, but it was more of a project that kind of highlighted this personal connection I was having with the people who would request poems from me.
In a moment of time as well. Not like,
yes,
I'll meet you and write something and get back to you next week. It was like in the moment in front of the person.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Kind of like busking poems.
Yeah, kind of like busking poems. Yeah. And now there's many people who do this around the country, but for 12 years, that was my only job.
I didn't think about the fact that you didn't get to keep a copy of it.
Well, I could have, I suppose, but I really enjoyed not doing that because it allowed the kind of egoless process to be the thing that was most important. It wasn't about me keeping something and doing something with it later. It was about the moment and my connection with the person. And I really liked the freedom in that as an artist, but also, how rare is it as a writer to get to witness your audience respond to what you write? And it was incredible.
That is okay. So the first 100 poems, were they difficult compared to the last in the batch of 40,000 poems? Like, were the beginning days of that project really difficult then?
They weren't, I wouldn't say difficult.
Okay.
But I think that what happened, I think that it was not difficult for me. And that's why I kept doing it, because I was surprised at how much I could access in such a brief moment with someone. And because of my surprise and intrigue, that's sort of what kept it going. And then it became my job. But over time, what happens with practice, I think overall, is that we learn how to do something, we build a muscle for it. And I could tell that over time, I ended up giving myself these sort of interesting restrictions with like paper size. And I learned like methodically where I would break my lines so that I wouldn't have to think about that. Cause a lot of it was about speed because there'd be people lined up waiting for poems. So
The pressure.
yeah,
Oh, wow.
I think it really taught me about what, being an artist and creating sort of these frameworks for ourselves. It's like so much comes from that. And, creating a boundary or creating some kind of discipline and then practicing that over and over again and like what you can uncover when you create your own container. And I think, most people who are creative are trying to do that for themselves.
Nice. Okay. And so I talk to authors often, and some of the comments I get back is some of the early authors, when they're early in their journey, struggle with kind of that writer's block, hitting a wall and not finding inspiration on the day of writing. And when you're sitting in front of somebody and they're looking at you eyeball to eyeball and you have to write for them in the moment, there's no time for writer's block. You have to kind of push through that. How did all that exercise of writing so much in that amount of time, how did that shape you as an author today?
Yeah, I think it allowed me to learn how to access the muse in a quicker way and a more direct way. Like I would kind of describe it with language, like I opened up some sort of channel for myself. And then now it's always there. And so I can kind of tap into it whenever I choose. But I also have some particular things that I like to say about writer's block. And this kind of like feeds into my new book that we'll talk about, which is this idea of, first of all, I never experienced that during the project of Poem Store. I never sat in front of someone and said, I'm sorry, I don't know what to write, because that in that particular case, like they're giving me a lot of feeling and information just by being there, and empathetically I'm receiving from them. But in my own space, privately creating my books and creating whatever work I want, I don't really consider myself someone who gets blocked necessarily, as more that I like to look at those times and kind of examine them as periods of rest and knowing when to have compassion for myself, that it's okay to not have ideas all the time. And it's okay to, show up to my desk and want to write. And maybe that looks really bountiful one day. And then another day it looks really minimal. And instead of kind of assigning this block to myself, I like to reframe that. I think that's just what works for me, but it also feels like very generous. And sometimes I wonder why we aren't more generous with ourselves in that space. And I think that kind of has to do with like our ideas of output and how we think we should be making something. And that really there's like times of year that work really well for that. There are like seasons where output is way more, there's a lot more happening. And then there are times when it's not like that.
Okay, so let's then talk directly to the author listening who is struggling with output right now. I'm going to get out of the way, but can you talk to them and give them some inspiration, some words of encouragement if they're feeling that way right now and maybe a little down on themselves that they're not producing at the level that they want to?
Yeah. I think there's two sides to this conversation. One is sort of like more of an emotional, like mind, body, spirit side. And the other side is like a more functional, like purposeful, process-oriented approach. And I think those two things have to go hand in hand. So on the more emotional side of things, that's when I would ask myself and ask this person to check in with what's happening in your life. What have you been going through? What have your experiences been like? Have you been sleeping enough? Are you feeling like at home in your body? What time of year is it? How does that affect you? And kind of really like taking stock of, am I asking myself to be creative in a time where that's probably not going to happen? And then kind of letting that pressure release. And sometimes the recovery period after releasing the pressure is way faster than we could imagine. Just letting yourself off the hook actually does wonders for letting the, creative framework kind of rebuild. But sometimes that takes time. And so that looks towards the functional side of the coin, which is like, what practice and what process can I apply that I know works for me, that has worked in the past. And maybe that's also a cyclical thing. Like, okay, at this time of year, this is typically what I need. I need to go on a little retreat, or I need to return to the practice of, taking care of and tending to my body first. Or it's the time of year where everyone's returning to the outside world. Like maybe I need to start re-engaging with that, and then more inspiration will come. Like there are all these tools that are there for the functional return to practice. And I don't think we can kind of like force ourselves to fit into those practices if it's, the wrong time of year, or if we're experiencing things that are really difficult in our personal life and then we're trying to turn that into artwork. Sometimes that doesn't work. Sometimes we need the more generous space of a practice that looks a little bit more, connected to our spirit or our emotion.
So in the process of your writing journey, you now, as we celebrate book 8 coming out in December, I was joking that you have your own library you're building just of your own works, which is amazing. Can you give us, just before we jump into book 8, which is coming up, can you give us a little bit of a synopsis of what you've written up to book 8 as well? Give us a little background on that as well.
Yeah, I got a degree in poetry, and in studying poetry, basically my option was, what happens next is you get a master's and then you get a PhD and then you teach poetry. And I was not interested in just kind of sticking to the, university institutional setting. So I went out into the world, and I ended up, my first book was something that I actually did start in school. And it's a collection of found photographs that have narrative poems that go along with them. So that was my first book that came out in 2009. And then after that, I created a book called Go Ahead and Like It, which is kind of a guide to writing lists of things that you like in moments of, dis-ease, or in moments where you might be feeling blocked, or, it's kind of like a gratitude list, but also with this sort of like artful inspiration spin on it. And that's like a full color photograph, like all the lists are scanned. That was a really fun art book that I made.
Nice.
And following that, I did a trilogy of poetry books about the places that I lived in California. So Northern California, Los Angeles, and Joshua Tree. So that trilogy was a big effort. And that came from me just recognizing in my journals and going through the process of reflecting on all that I'd been creating over the years, that I already had a lot of material about California. And then I realized, I should turn this into a series. And let's see, after that came Help in the Dark Season, which is a book of poems kind of exploring childhood trauma and love and relationship. I had a publisher ask me to write a book of love poems, and I sat down to start that process and was like, well, I don't think I can write about love without writing about my childhood trauma first. So that's going to be part of this. And then following that, I wrote Every Day is a Poem, that is a book that kind of explores how to cultivate a poetic mindset. So it's more of like a toolkit for engaging with the world as a poet might. And there's a lot of writing exercises and writing and creative information. It is a guidebook, but it's also just based on this idea that you can cultivate a poetic mindset on and off the page. So that was my last book, and now this new book we'll talk about.
Now we get to talk about the new one. Yes, let's go.
Yeah, the new book is A Year in Practice, and seasonal rituals and prompts to awaken cycles of creative expression. So this book, kind of following Every Day is a Poem, it's this like more of a framework that kind of adheres to this idea that the earth is providing guidance constantly for us, and that lives like inherently in us. And even if we're not aware or connected, or, deep down inside, or maybe even close to the surface, we are responding to these natural rhythms, this cadence of the seasonal shifts, and that energy actually shows us a lot of, when to be creative, when to not, like when we're contracting, when we're expanding. And if I could say that the book is doing anything, like the main thesis is that it's just sort of attempting to remind people that all of that information is right there for them. And I give a lot of examples of practices and ways to cultivate that and remember that. But it's not a prescriptive book. It's not like, here, do this, and then this will happen. It's more like this is what this energy of winter looks like. This is how you could apply it to your practice. Here are all of these little ideas and doorways and entry points. And then it will be different for you, no matter who you are or where you live. And you can apply it and kind of figure out the experiment yourself. And it should supply you with a lot of information about what, maybe when you're blocked and what that looks like and why. And maybe that's perfectly aligned with, the pause in the seasonal rhythm. And you might not think that. You might be being hard on yourself, but actually it's winter and you're not supposed to be doing very much, or, something like that.
Okay. So I know in podcasting, we always kind of focus on who our ideal listener is. We try to build our podcast and episodes around that person. So we're talking to someone, not just speaking into the air. Mm-hmm. Did you have somebody in mind as you were writing your book?
Yeah, I think there's a twofold concept of someone who's interested in practice, the idea of practice, and a big part of that is like creative practice. So people who are like interested and curious about figuring out a creative framework that works for them. And I see this a lot in all types of artistic settings where folks are trying to like figure out how to better align with a rhythm that works for them, like what time of day to create and how long and what was the thing that inspired them and how do they then find the time to, put that down on the page or make a song about it or paint about it. And then so this book is kind of like an answer that's like, here, there's this framework actually that exists in the natural world that's accessible and free to all of us. And this is just kind of a reminder and some examples of how you might try to start engaging with that. And then the other side of practice, I think, is actually just like a little bit more widespread, which is just we're all trying to practice life and living, and that we are all constantly trying to figure out like how to either live better or live more aligned to, things that feel like that they're flowing in an easier way. And I think that there's this kind of widespread dissociation that happens, this forgetfulness that happens. There's so much in the way of us being able to connect with this sort of base level, simple information that the earth is offering. And so, to me, I'm just trying to say, reader who is curious about frameworks of existence and rhythms that naturally exist, here's a way in to remember that.
What have you learned about yourself as an author by writing this book?
Gosh, a lot. I've never written a book like this. It's totally different than everything I've ever written. It involved like this really curious balance of experimenting with these practices that I know work for me and kind of trying to reflect on them in a way more nuanced, deeply observational way. And then documenting all of that, like this is how this works for me. And then balancing that with considering how that would work for other people. And helpful that it has, these seasonal lenses put on it so that I had like a container to put myself in and to put my work in and see in this season, how am I affected? What happens to me? What happens to my practice? I definitely was surprised by how intense spring is for me.
Okay.
Spring is like such a beautiful time and everyone loves spring. But I realized while writing this book that spring is actually like incredibly harsh, and the shift, the transition from winter to spring is so difficult for me, especially as a creative person, where I'm like in this great cocoon where I feel like I have a little bit more opportunity all winter long to have uninterrupted time to create. And then spring happens and it's like, and now everything's coming out and there's all this exposure and it's really harsh. Yeah. And I think I was surprised at how intense that was for me.
That's interesting, because that's where I was going to go with you. The next question was, what season was the one that you seem to wrestle with the most? Mm-hmm. And that's like, because you're right, like between fall and winter, it seems to be more of a gradual blending of the two seasons. Summer into fall, similar. It seems to kind of blend. It just gets cooler and then, it's fall, But yeah, that's more of an abrupt moment in time between winter and spring. I totally resonate with that as well.
Yeah, I think the transitions are really difficult. And I pay homage to that in the book and kind of address each transition because, when we find our rhythm and we get going, it's like the end of November right now. I'm in this great rhythm of fall where there's like all this like stockpiling and gathering of my resources. And like, it's like the last big surge of the season. And I love that feeling. It's like very electric. But I also recognize that winter is like right around the corner. And that kind of stresses me out. Once I'm in winter, it is my most favorite season. I mean, it's the longest chapter in the book. I have so much that happens for me creatively in the winter. But the shift from fall to winter, it's hard for me to downshift. I'm excited. I'm like lit by the feeling of fall. And then I'm suddenly like, oh gosh, I can see the shadow of winter in the corner. And I'm like, oh, I'm not quite ready. And yet I am kind of ready, but I don't want to give up this last charge of energy because I find it really useful. So it's a balancing act.
I don't think you could shut off that poetic side of you. The shadow of winter. You just said that. I'm like, no.
It never shuts off.
Like a
no
visual,
way.
Right?
Yeah.
It's with 40,000 poems, I don't think you can shut that off. So, okay. What I love about having you on is that, again, the audience for this podcast is a split between authors looking to find their legs as an author and then readers who are just looking for their next great book. And what your book seems to offer is the best of both worlds to both audiences. So you're the perfect guest for my show, and I'm so happy you're here. Okay, for the reader then, who's not an author, but just loves the creative process, and maybe they're going to take your work and apply it to music or painting, like you talked about. What's your hope for the reader that picks up this book for the very first time and falls in love with it? What is your message, your love letter to them as a reader? What do you want them to know about this book?
The book is full of poems. So that to me is like my gift to the reader. Like I didn't want to make, and I never will make, a book that's just strictly like this prescriptive information. I was like, oh, I'm going to like tune each one of these sections to a poem. So there's poems that kind of highlight and accentuate the feeling of each practice that I offer up. And also I think the way that I talk about what happens to me as a creative person within the experiment of these practices that I work through in the book, I think that lends itself to the reader too, of like this exploration that they can kind of go on with me, which when I read, that's sort of what I'm looking for. I'm looking for this reflection point with the writer where I can follow them through whatever journey they went on. And in that, I probably see myself in certain places. I see where they've built these invitations for me to see myself. And then the poems kind of do this great, they come in and just accentuate all of that. So I think like at any time there's like a inkling of feeling or sensation or personal experience that I highlight in a section, then a poem comes in to say, yes, that's exactly right. Let me reaffirm that for you.
Okay. And then for my audience that are authors, I have a young audience as well listening to the podcast. I've had authors on that are as young as 5 years of age. And now they've written 6 books at 10 years of age. And I'm like, I don't remember what I was doing at 5 to be writing a book. And then I've had authors on up in their 80s and 90s writing for the very first time. And it's beautiful to see someone find their author voice and pursue that. But I'm thinking of like someone in high school English class, and the assignment on the board says, today we're going to be writing poems. And there's eye rolling and, oh my gosh, I'm not creative. I can't do this. I can't find my voice in writing poems and writing poetry. Your thoughts to that person, a young person early in their journey of becoming an author, writing poems maybe, what is the thing that we can light for them in their spirit for them to go, I have something to say and I'm unique in who I am. And I really want to share my voice through poetry. How can we stoke that flame for them as they listen to our podcast? Yeah,
I do a lot of work in schools and in classrooms with students, especially at the like middle school, high school level. And I think that the most important thing in the beginning of that experience that I've noticed is this like simplicity of saying, okay, we're going to write about whatever subject, be it your own identity, your own personal experience, or with the work I do, I'm usually trying to focus on the natural world and getting them to connect with the landscape and their surroundings. And then I say, okay, your senses are your way in. Whatever you can think of connected to this subject matter, and using your own senses to either have a memory or asking yourself, the first image that comes to my mind when I think of the natural world is, and they're going to, maybe they'll just say a hawk. I saw a hawk on my way to school today. And then they're like, okay, so I say, what does the hawk sound like? What does it look like? What is it? Can you imagine what it would be saying to you? And like letting their senses kind of guide them into their imaginative state. And one thing that happens when I work in the classroom with students in this way is they all have something to say because they're all having a sensory input constantly. And they'll write it down in a different way. They say it in their own way, but they're all having some kind of input happen to them. And usually, reflecting on the natural world, especially like an urban setting, is very nuanced and unique. So each student will have their own response to that. And I think so much poetry just comes from having the ability to observe, to like check in with your senses, and then at the same time having the time and space to do that. So when they're given this chance in the classroom to have this time and space to like listen and think about what it felt like to see the hawk, or try to relay that information, they have the skill. It's there. It's just they don't always have the time and space to do it.
And that's what a good symbolism for life. And one thing somebody told me when I was young was, we all seem to have that one sweater that everything seems to stick to. And you're constantly picking things off. You're like, how did that get on me? But let life be like that, like a sweater that things just stick to. And experiences that you have and things that you see and live through, let those things stick to you and become part of who you are, so that you can then draw from that and use that as a creative way to express yourself. Because those are all pieces of you and stories around your world that maybe someone else hasn't experienced the way you have.
I love that.
So let those things stick to you, And as we look at our sweaters, as we're talking, probably people are looking, going,
no, I literally just looked at my sweater and was like, crap all over my sweater. Yeah.
The same thing. So you're having an impact on me now as I'm talking to you, as I'm seeing the world that way. And I think that's something we can all do. And that might really help us in our writing process, is to draw from every day. The hawk, great example. Draw from your everyday and then turn that into a story or something that can spark creativity for you in your writing.
Yeah.
I love that.
I think even the feeling of thinking about everything you just said, the sweater, that whole example, and then the feeling of choosing something, focusing on it, using it, utilizing it, and making room for something else. And how there's like a relief built into that. And there's a reward built into self-inquiry and like reflecting on yourself. And one of the rewards is that you get to shed things and you get to call in new things and have new experience. And so the reward of inspiration, the reward of connecting with the earth, I don't think that that's actually focused on a lot in our society. Like, I don't think that we're like constantly aware of how immeasurable that reward is. Immense. It's like an infinite reward, because what happens is when you do practice it and you do find yourself engaged in this process of being creative, of trying to express yourself, you just uncover this incredible bounty of energy, of ideas, of connection with people, places, things. Everything starts to like brighten and lighten. Yeah. And I think that reward is like, not to be looked down upon or thought of as small. It's huge. It's like the biggest reward possible.
And I think if we can all understand that, instead of following social media to the extent where we want to replicate what we see on social media and being like someone else, why not be like us? Like, why not invest in our own view of the world instead of trying to replicate how someone else lives? Maybe we need to focus in on ourselves and realize that we have our own story to tell. We don't have to tell someone else's story. We can tell our own story.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a depth to who we are as a person.
Yeah, and how much more fun and
duplicated.
interesting is
Right?
that? I mean, like, that's just so much more fun and interesting. And I think that that's another big part of it that I like to highlight. The reward is that it's enjoyable.
Yeah. You have your own platform, and you have a voice, and you have an opinion and a view of the world that maybe no one else has, because you're uniquely you, and no one can duplicate you. So instead of chasing someone else's dream, when have you dreamt lately? What have you dreamt about? I love the idea that you're pulling that out of people by what you do, by demonstrating it yourself as an author, but as well, how you're giving us the tools to do it ourselves.
Right.
I love the combination of the two that you do.
I think for me that feeling of the combination is really important, because I'm actually not satisfied with only looking at myself and my own inner world. I think a lot of artists are, and I actually deeply respect that. There's no judgment there. I just think for me as this person who I am, like, the act of only looking in my own realm for inspiration is not enough. Like, I want to hear the voices of others, and I want to uplift those people. And I also want to give them the tools that have worked for me so that they might, highlight what they want to say more. And I find that, like, that feels like an act of service. Like, this idea of being in service and being creative seems just to go hand in hand for me. And it always has. And even writing those poems in public, there's this service element to it, because people could pay whatever they wanted to. So it didn't matter where you were from, what your, economic experience was, you could get a poem. And I thought that was something that really helped form the way I think about being an artist in the world, and like making things that are very accessible.
Yeah. And I love that we come back to that as well, because I know we weren't going to focus on the 40,000 poem story as much today because I want to talk about the new book, obviously, but I just feel like that's a groundwork that's happened, that's given you the platform to do what you do today. And
absolutely,
that's, again, I'm still wrestling with the idea that you didn't get to keep the 40,000 poems. I'm like, I didn't even consider that when we talked originally, but wow, like, to know that those poems are out in the world and have impact on people's lives beyond what you can measure, right? Like, what an unselfish gift to give to the world, to do that for people. Like, there had to be a reward just in that transaction as well.
Yeah, because how often do you get the opportunity to do things like that? And I think that's why I did it for so long, because it was just, it was magic. It was also psychically the most exhausting thing I've ever done. I think I tapped my battery out. Good thing I did it when I was really young, because now I'm like, okay, I think I've restored myself. But
I love it. I love it. So for the book, is there anything else that we haven't really touched on for the new book that you feel is something maybe we've been missing from our conversation today that you want to include, so that people buying the book for the first time or gifting it would resonate with what's in the covers of this book?
Yeah, I think it's a book that is built for people who are curious about finding that framework, like I said, and then also understanding how to connect with the earth in a deeper way, who are already sort of like curious and interested in, just any kind of natural world, nature connection, but also recognizing that it's full of questions. It's full of prompts. It's full of, this guidance that came from the planet. So I think that there's this setup with the book that's very creative. It's going to guide you as a creative, but it's also going to guide you to sort of look closer at the world around you. A lot of people will ask me, how do you keep your connection to the earth? And I just go outside. But I think going outside might seem kind of foreign and limited to a lot of folks. And that this book is kind of like this helpful guide to like, what do you do when you're out there, to like try to learn how to be a little bit more attuned, or, maybe there's a lot of questions I think that come up with this search for a rhythm and a cadence in our practice. And we don't always think of the earth as the guide, but I do think that this book will kind of reaffirm that bounty is there for everyone.
I love it. Okay, so Jacqueline, I have one more question at the end. I'm saving that, though, because I want you to share with the people listening how they can get this book, where they can contact you and be in touch with you, where you're active on social media, all that information. And then I have one more question here at the end of the podcast.
Okay.
Sure. How do we get in touch with you?
Yeah. The book, A Year in Practice, is for sale December 5th. You can get it anywhere you get your books, anywhere online, anywhere that you like to buy your books. And then to be in touch with me, I have a website, JacquelineSuskin.com. I have an Instagram that I use a lot. That's jsuskin. And I have a Substack, and I put out a newsletter every month. So you can just search for me on there, Jacqueline Suskin.
Nice. We'll have links to all that in the show notes. Now, I would be remiss to not ask this of you, and I didn't get permission to do this beforehand. So people listening, this could be great. This could be, I don't know how this is going to turn out. But for someone with so prolific in writing, in poetry, and the new book, I think that all of us listening would be sad to not have something from you, from your poetic background, that you could share with us, one of your poems that we could end off the podcast. Is that possible?
Oh, I'd love to read a poem. Yeah.
I would love it.
Let's see.
To have it in the voice of the author is something special, I really think, as a listener. So I think this is a great gift to those that have been with us so far.
Wonderful. I would love to read a poem.
Okay.
Well, how about I'll read from the opening winter chapter of A Year in Practice. There are these meditative poems that kind of break up the book to show like the different parts of each season. And this is where it starts. And the poem is called Rest. Imagine all of the life underground that is waiting for spring. Envision the resting roots, the sleeping creatures, and everything below the surface that is paused for the season. Feel the fullness of this stillness. Feel the necessity of this calmness. There is silence here, in every den, in every inch of cold dirt. There is silence in your home as well. Your body needs this pause. Your mind revels in this quietness. Winter speaks to you and says, rush no longer. Put down whatever you carry, curl up and rest. Scan yourself from toe to head and head to toe, letting yourself unwind, releasing all demands. Breathe into every inch of your body as it relaxes into this healing state. Imagine yourself in a warm cocoon, wrapped in glowing light. No need to go anywhere or do anything. No need for any plan at all. Return to this place of respite every time you crave the grace of winter's restful energy. Remember, everything else is asleep now, too. Give yourself permission to go into the cave and turn inward.
Oh, I love that. Mm-hmm. And remember that everything else is at rest as well. I love that. Mm-hmm. That's such a great one. I thank you for closing it off with that. That's special. That's really, really special. Everyone, all the information's in the show notes. You need to go buy this book. You need to support another amazing author. And this is a great book as well for gift-giving season. So I would love to see people reach out and support you. And as well, please, when you buy the book, wherever you purchase, please leave an amazing review to let other people know what you found and the treasure you now have in your hands, because I think more people need to hear about this book. Jacqueline, thank you so much for being on Living the Next Chapter.
Thank you.
Jumping here at the very end, I want to thank you for coming. We have listeners around the world, and I got to tell you, as a podcaster, it is so great to hear back from the people who listen to the show. Now, you are still here. The podcast's over. Like, we're sweeping up and putting the chairs away. You're still here. So, hi. I would love to talk to you. No, I really, really would. I would love to hear your voice. I would love to hear from you through email. You can do all that at livingthenextchapter.com. I say it fast. because I love it. Living the Next Chapter. It's the name of the podcast. .com. How's that for easy? Right? Right. So come on over there and let's have a conversation. You can set up time in my calendar. You can, air quote here, book. Book time in my calendar. Book next chapter. Let's have a conversation. Thanks for being here. See you on the next one. Cheers.
Are you searching for your next favorite author? Then Book Banter with Diane Burkhart is the podcast for you. We have amazing guests from indie authors to traditionally published authors and every hybrid in between. If you're an author, we have something for you too. Besides being able to be a guest on our show, we also pepper our lineup occasionally with publishing industry professionals like editors, publicists, marketing coaches, and so many more are coming. So be sure to check out Book Banter with Diane Burkhart, Book Talk Podcast, with new episodes dropping every Wednesday. You can find us on the major streaming services or on our own website, burkhartbooks.com/podcast. Be sure to subscribe today so you never miss an episode, because if you love books like we do, you do not want to miss this podcast.